All right, guys, it's time to take our seats. This is one session you don't want to miss. Actually, every session is one session you don't want to miss. So who here does not know who John Pugliano is? You don't?
Haters.
About John Pugliano is that he loves money. It's not just that he doesn't hate it. He loves money. Do you love money, John?
I love money.
He also has a great podcast. Even if you're at a place in your life where you're not ready to invest, the Wealth Studying Podcast is a great way to start getting your mindset ready for when you are ready to invest. I highly recommend it. Plus, as David likes to say, our friend David Siegler, you could listen to this man's voice all day long. Now, the reason we didn't do it as a first session is we thought maybe straight out of the chute with statistics wasn't where we wanted to go today. But now I really do want to know, is 2023 a global recession? I'm going to hand it over to you, John.
Thanks. Hey, great to be here. Beautiful weather for camping, isn't it? All right. Hey, so I'm going to talk about global recession. I know there's been a lot of debate about whether we're already in one or if we've been in one. You know, I don't debate all those things. I really don't care about the little nuances of things and exactly predicting the future or anything like that. What I'm concerned with is just getting the big trends accurately so that I can trade them, right? So whether things go up or they go down, I just want to figure out how to position myself to make money because I do love money, okay? Important thing to remember on all this is the reason I love money is because it buys me freedom, right? So ultimately, I love freedom. So whenever you hear me say I love money, I'm really saying I love freedom, okay? Plus, my wife only stays with me because I make lots of money, and so I got to keep it. So I'm going to go through a bunch of slides, some of them fast. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see all of them, but you will be able to get copies of it. I'm around all the rest of the weekend if you have questions, and then you can always reach me through either one of my websites. And then finally, a legal disclaimer. This is all my opinion. You would be crazy to take anything I say as, you know, the gospel truth and go out and act on it, right? I'm just giving you my opinion. Okay, so right now we are in the midst of a pandemic hangover. We all knew this was coming. We actually see the volatility in the stock market like we're seeing this year. I didn't think we'd see that until next year. And these numbers are not exactly accurate as of today because they're actually a few weeks old. And even if you just saw yesterday, the NASDAQ was up like 7% just yesterday alone. Best day in like 2 or 3 years. So they're all subject to change. But the point I want to make with this slide is that everything's been affected this past year, right? Or actually over the past 18 months. So, things like you saw the big rise in things like lumber or copper or cement. Those things have all basically had peaked last year or earlier this year. So as to whether the big headline this week that drove the stock market up so much was that inflation is declining, right? It was only 7.7% instead of 8.2. I've been making the case all along that we are definitely in deflation because these numbers did peak, but the Federal Reserve is going to manipulate the numbers anyways, right? So whether it's 3% or 5% or 10%, they're not going to tell us the real number. But again, we don't really want to worry about that. We just want to get the directions of the trends right. But everything has suffered, and you'll see everything, right? Whether it's oil's come down, gold's come down, steel. Do I have bonds on there? Yeah, right at the top, 20-year treasuries. That's a key point I want to make. Wall Street will tell you that bonds are safe. They've been telling older people that for years, okay? They'll tell you that you should have a 60-40 split to balance out your portfolio. The long-term bonds this year have done worse than the stock market, okay? Just keep that in mind. Bonds are not safe. Someday I'll write a book like Dr. Barry that says something like, lies my financial advisor told me. Okay, so global recession coming, but it is brewing, depending upon how you want to define it. These numbers are hard to see, but trust me, all those red areas, those are numbers that are well below 50, and these are a calculation of the PMIs, Purchasing Manager Index numbers. Anything below 50 is contracting, a contracting economy. So these are all the major economies of the world, and other than pretty much the Philippines and a couple other places, everything's doing really bad. Everything is already in decline. And the question is, will it get worse? Okay. And the next one you're going to see several times. The question I ask is, if it's going to get worse, that's what really matters, because these are the two times that everybody remembers when things got worse in the last 20, 25 years. The red line is the housing bubble. The blue line is the dot-com bubble. What I want to point out here is, until you see those major events I have up there, the terrorist attacks and the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, until that time, it was just a normal garden variety recession, right? Things were bad, right? They could improve. But once we got to these, they call them black swan events, but, you know, just events that you weren't necessarily expecting or being able to, things got bad, and they got bad quick. The dot-com bubble, we all talk about the dot-com bubble. We all remember when the tech stocks crashed in 2000. But what most people forget is things didn't really get bad until after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which was in some cases a year, year and a half later, depending upon how you measured when that dot-com bubble burst. So what I really want to key in here is, you know, Jack talks about when things get tougher, even when they don't. We don't always know when things are going to break. But when they do, they get really bad. This is a chart that I have, and these axes are as close as I could get to them. I'm not trying to do the rattlesnake where you hold it out and make it accurate charts in terms of the comparison of the two. The blue one is the dot-com bubble. The red one is where we are right now, okay? I don't show this to scare people. I show this to say that we are in the garden variety recession, but if something breaks, look what can happen, okay? If you think it's bad now, it can get a lot worse. But, right, even when things don't, you know, time to get tougher, even when they don't. This is the last 25 or so years. Look at all the times when the garden variety recession didn't get worse, right? We remember the worst times that it did, but really there's only trend line, and one of them didn't count because it was a pandemic. I don't count that one. But these other ones that were severe and lasted a long time, they don't always happen. They're rare when they come along. And this is really why you do want to be long-term on any kind of appreciating asset, any kind of equity, because over time, as long as you're sticking with the winners, things do improve and get better. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some things. I'm trying not to be gloom and doom here. I think you guys all know that I'm probably about the most optimistic person you'll ever meet. And I'll say some scary things. Some of the things are going to be more nuanced. I don't have time to go into them all, so I'll talk gloom and doom. And you got to be careful when you do that, because when you go down that rabbit hole, you never know what you're going to find. And be careful. Facebook is selling people's images. Be careful. Okay, so what could go wrong, right? Well, I'm going to cover about 4 or 5 areas here. They're listed here. We'll hit each one of them. So what can go wrong? Let's look at the first one, Fed over tightening. I have been very optimistic through the summer. It really wasn't until we got into late August and really into late September that I started getting much more concerned. And because, again, the data all kept telling me this is a garden variety recession. And when I started to get negative is when the Federal Reserve started to change their tune. Because just this summer alone, they were talking about rates going up to maybe 3 3/4. I don't get emotionally attached in things. I run the numbers and I run scenarios. And as long as we stay below 4%, I was pretty confident that things will work out, right? The Federal Reserve is raising interest rates to get people fired, right? That's the bottom line. They have a dual mandate that they talk about. It's price stability and maximum employment. And those are just cover for them doing all the other things they do. But the important thing with that maximum employment is to, you know, put people in and out of work to suit their needs. And so what they want to do by raising rates, they want to throw, you know, 2.5 million or so people out of work. And as long as we stay in that 4% range, I think that's fine. People will lose their jobs. The reason that works for them cutting back on it, working to reduce inflation, is that, you know, they can't pump any oil to lower oil prices. They can't grow any wheat to lower food prices. But what they can is they can throw people out of work, and that brings down wages. You know, 60% of a company's budget is wages, and that's how they bring down inflation. So that. I know I'm not going to get fired because, right, I work for myself, so I'm okay with that. But they have started, and even just in September and now in November, they've raised that target up now as high as 5.25%. No, you can't believe that though, right? Because they lie. Right? It could go to 8, it could go to 2. We don't know. You literally cannot believe anything they say because they change their mind. 18 months, probably 13 months from previously, they were telling you they weren't going to raise rates until at least the end of 2023. Right now, they're talking in the next few months, we're going to be over 5. Oh, I'm sorry. So this is it's essentially the interest that they pay on the member banks that they keep money with them. And so by raising the interest rates, they can keep more money in the system with them, and that's less money in the economy. So when things are bad, they cut the interest rates, as we've seen for the last couple of decades of really low interest rates. They cut interest rates low, the Fed funds rate low, to get that money out into the economy because banks are required to keep a certain amount of reserves. And if they don't want to encourage, during bad times, they don't want to encourage those reserves. They want those reserves to come out in the economy. This is what we call printing money, right? This is how they print money. So that's bad news. The other big problem about this, other than just employment, and I'll just talk off a couple of these quickly. Financing the government debt. We all know about the government debt. I don't get overly worried about the excesses in government debt, again, because when I was a little kid in the VFW club outside the coal mine in Pennsylvania, I used to hear drunk coal miners debating, we were going to go bankrupt because we were at whatever it was, $100 billion in debt back then or whatever. So I don't worry much about that. We'll talk about that in a minute here too. But the problem with this is, and again, as we get over that 4%, the amount that the government has to pay on the money that they borrow really goes up high. So at just 3.5% rates, that's over $1 trillion that the government has to pay in interest payments. Again, they're talking about 5.25. If they were to keep it up that high, that would put, that would put the interest payment on the debt at extreme levels to the emergency money that we saw being handed out in the pandemic. So that's very worrying. And then as far as regular people are concerned, you've seen interest rates get up and in some cases exceeding 7% for mortgages. Again, that's what they want to do. The Federal Reserve wants to slow down. The question is, do they take that too far and something breaks? Over the last year, people have complained, housing costs are going up 20% a year or 18% a year. Well, with the Federal Reserve raising rates now, so it's caused mortgages to go up to 7%, that's really made a 50% increase in the payment for someone's house. The problem with that is none of that money goes to the homeowner. None of that money goes to the guys that are putting on the roof or, the building contractors or anybody, the real estate agents. That extra money is all going to service the debt, which goes to the banks. Okay, so that's what's so insidious about it. You saw a couple of weeks ago, you might have saw the Bank of England had to react because really the whole UK pension system was about to fall apart. It's something we've talked about in the United States is all these pension funds are undervalued or underinvested. And eventually they're probably going to have to need bailouts to stay in existence. Well, we saw a little microcosm of that happening in England a couple of weeks ago because as the US dollar kept getting stronger on these higher interest rates, that not only made the old bonds cheaper. I don't even know if I have time to explain this. Let me just say it this way. When the bond values go down, okay? The principle, like I talked about, you can lose money in bonds. The way that affected the English government was, number one, not only did their currency devaluate in terms of the U.S. as a currency, but also their bonds went down. All their pension funds are invested in bonds because bonds are safe. Well, those bonds came down so low, the value of them, that they got margin calls on their debt, and they had to sell more of those bonds to raise money, which made the bonds go even lower in value and decrease the currency more, and then it just spiraled, right? And so the Bank of England had to step in and do a bunch of quantitative easing to pull them out of that. These are these little kind of things in developed nations, because the underdeveloped or the developing nations are in a lot of trouble, right? I just want to make the emphasis that we're talking about England here. Has had a major crisis in currency and in their pension system. Imagine what's going to happen to Greece or Bangladesh or somebody else. So these are the things when I say what can break. There's some significant areas, and it has to do with these bonds. We talked about the myth of the 60-40 portfolio split. The strong U.S. dollar is causing we're exporting inflation to other countries. So all the commodities are priced in U.S. dollars. So when our dollar goes up, that means people in Spain have to pay more for copper or any other commodities. So we're exporting that inflation to them. Their economies are already weak. Their currencies are already low. And then on top of that, they have to pay even more to buy the commodity products that they need. Also, the United States and the financial system over the last 20 years, 30 years has really wised up. They used to price a lot of debt in local currency, but they don't do that anymore. They price debt in American dollars. So if you're in Vietnam and you got a loan in your emerging business, it's likely priced somehow in U.S. dollars. You not only have maybe higher interest rates to meet, but your currency value has gone down. So you've got a double whammy of how we create these currency crises. And it's not only going to hit these emerging markets, it's going to hit the developed nations as well. This goes along with all the zombie companies and zombie governments that we've seen, over these last 15 years that have existed on. People have business models that are existed on cheap money with zero financing, sort of similar to what we saw with the housing crisis in 2008, where people were buying money with nothing down, had very low interest rates. As soon as those interest rates came up, they couldn't afford their homes. Well, now we're seeing that's what's going to happen with governments. One other point, and this is how it affects our stock market, and this is with multinationals. Some 40 or more % of profits and revenues from our multinational companies come from overseas. So, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Microsoft, they sell a lot of products overseas. Once again, they're selling those products, though, in local currencies. They bring that money back to the U.S. They have to translate it into the U.S. dollar. If the U.S. dollar is up 18% from those other currencies, even if Microsoft sold more just as much as last year, they've now taken an 18% hit on their foreign sales. And so you're seeing that's one of the reasons. So these rising dollars, rising interest rates, it affects everything, and the poor. Separate topic, still related to all this, and it's political and civil disorder. And again, I'm just going to talk mostly about developed nations here. I mean, look at the strikes we've seen in Europe and in the UK. Not only just because of all the UK, because of all the COVID lockdowns, but people striking because their wages are depreciating. They're unhappy with immigration policies. Obviously, it's been 6 or so years ago that we saw the UK break away from the EU, but there's more and more that civil. Just some crazy ideas here. If you haven't been paying attention, like Israel has had 3 prime ministers in the last 2 years. Right? Netanyahu got thrown out, was gone for about 18 months, and was reelected back in. UK has gone through 4 prime ministers in 3 years, and one of them served for only about 43 days. Okay, just a lot of we think our politics is crazy here. It's just as bad everywhere else. Italy, Sweden, again, both 3 prime ministers in 1 year. Finland, and I pointed in Norway. I'm pointing out these kind of northern European countries we think are really stable and relatively homogenous societies. Well, Finland, Norway, 2 or 3 prime ministers in the last year or 3. So crazy things going on. Former prime minister of Japan was assassinated earlier this year. The big riots we're seeing and protests in Iran with the morality police. Brazil, Lulu, the guy that just won president there, he had been in jail on corruption charges and got out, and now he's back to being the president. It's we live in really interesting times. The whole Southern Hemisphere, kind of in my interpretation, is really going Marxist, for lack of another word to call it. Supposedly that we're trying to keep those kind of things out, and we're not that we should. I don't want to say here that I think that we should interfere with it, but we're not even imposing the supposed Monroe Doctrine to keep unwanted influences from like communist China out of South America. I think that's all going to come back to bite us. Bottom line on all this, the media is going to play it their way. So when England or Italy or somebody wants to break off from the European Union, it's not because they want sovereignty. It's because, they're white nationalist supremacists. Big that it's all about the far right and this and that. But the bottom line is people are protesting everywhere. The European Union is fragile. It's been fragile for years. That's why I've never really worried much about the U.S. dollar losing reserve currency status. A topic for another day. But when you look at all these other currencies like the euro, they're as bad as we are. They're all worse. Okay, and I think and I said it last year when I was here. I think when something breaks, it's going to be overseas, right? I don't know where it's going to be, but in this last case, has turned out to be Ukraine's obviously a bad situation. We got problems with Chinese and Taiwan. I don't know how any of those escalate, but I think most of the energy, I didn't call this an energy crisis. I call this an energy policy crisis. Okay. And this is very much like, again, when I was a little kid drinking Coke at the Veterans of Foreign War bar with my grandfather outside the coal mine in the in this case, it was in 1973, but those late 1960s through most of the mid 70s, we were in an energy crisis. Those of you that were alive back then, you remember all the gas stations didn't have gas. You can only buy fuel based on your license plate. If it was an even or odd number. All of that was kind of deja vu of what we're seeing right now. Basically, Saudi Arabia was mad at the U.S. and other Western nations for supporting Israel, so they stopped or rolled back the amount of energy or oil that sell to us. Nowadays, we see it's kind of the other way, where Germany and the Western countries are imposing an embargo on Russian oil, but it's the same effect one way or the other, right? It's different. History rhymes, right? It doesn't repeat itself; it just rhymes. All the things that we saw in '73 are happening now. It's just a total echo. And the important thing to remember is that 1973-74 oil embargo didn't just stop then. It really put the U.S. in decline. Your energy crisis in 1979. So I think earlier people were saying, how long is the supply chain is going to last? I think Jack said 5 years or something. I don't know how long the supply chain issues are going to last, but they don't go away quickly. These are reoccurring problems that happen over years, if not decades. In the 70s, we had rampant inflation. And if you now hear about Paul Volcker having to raise interest rates, he didn't do that to the 80s, but it was all because of what was happening in the 70s that they had to do that in the 80s. We had just some things that went on in the 70s. 71 was when we went off the international gold standard. 1988 led to the 1985 Plazo Accord, which is where the U.S. dollar had to get devaluated. It's kind of works in reverse. And this is where you say right now, the two best asset classes this year are the U.S. dollar and oil. Okay. And you'd be saying, like, why isn't gold doing better? Why isn't silver doing better? Why isn't Bitcoin doing better? Well, when you go through these periods, people do flock to the U.S. dollar because it's the best house in a bad neighborhood. That's exactly what happened in the early 70s, even though the U.S. was devaluating its currency, pulling silver out of its coins, pulling itself out of the international gold standard. High that by the time we got into 1985, they had to have a Plaza Accord where they forced countries like Germany and Japan to devalue their dollars, to devalue their currencies against the dollar. So the point I'm kind of make here is that these fluctuations, and when they fool with the interest rates, it causes reoccurring problems. And one problem makes the next one even worse, because when they force those countries to devalue their currency, what that led to later on in the 80s and the early 90s was currency crisis that we saw throughout Asia. If you think back to the Asian currency crisis, when a lot of countries' currencies collapsed initially. So these are the bad things that can happen in the future. America totally deindustrialized after the Arab oil embargo. That's when, all what we now call the Rust Belt, that's when all that stuff was going on. That's how I ended up joining the Marine Corps in 1979, right? Because there weren't any jobs in Pittsburgh. That's how the Navy had lousy uniforms. I had to join the Marines. We hear all this talk about green stuff, right? Where we have a Inflation Reduction Act, which is just a big boondoggle for green energy. We hear people talking about putting, instead of trying to go taxes on the energy companies, they call them windfall profit taxes, stuff like that, right? It's nothing new. Same thing. Nixon was president back then. He was a Republican, okay? He put on wage and price controls. They talked about windfall profit tax on the oil companies and never actually did that. But they did a number of other things that actually reduced our overall production of energy, including, all the EPA, Clean Water Act, all that was formed by the Republicans that hate the environment, supposedly, right? These things never change, though. They keep going back and doing the same playbook over and over again. So as we see more money put into the green energy, ultimately we're still going to need more fall. Just deja vu of 73. My big thing here in red is can the EU survive? We're seeing, if you remember back in 2012, the Greek bailouts of the Greek banks. Now it's not the Greek banks. It's the Italian banks. It's the British banks, right? It's going to maybe be the German banks. Deutsche Bank is in big trouble right now. The Swiss banks, huge trouble, right? It's not Greece anymore. It's the major European countries. Cold War II. Okay, I'm calling this escalation because we've been in a Cold War for a continuation of many of the trends that were already happening in place. It just accelerated them. That's what we're seeing now with this, energy policy crisis that we have. We've been in a Cold War for years, and kind of just to point this out, we started to have some decent relationships with the Russians in the late 90s. But as early as 2002, the relationship with them started to sour. That's when we got away from the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty. Okay, from really 2002 on, every year we deteriorated our relations with the Russians. So what's going on now is I had to go back and look this up because I always talk about the great firewall of China, the great China Wall, the China firewall. They went in and they basically censored and shut down portions of the internet. They did that in 1998, right? I didn't get dial-up modem until like 96. So they were putting this stuff in place. That surveillance state isn't something they're just doing now with their current president. This is their long-term thought process. It's been going on for decades. In 2002, we admitted China into the World Trade Organization. That's when their growth started to really explode as far as their economic expansion. But by just 2000, their military, and we saw them then that year increase their military capacity by 18%. They've been doing similar things every year since. So nothing new about the Cold War. I kind of sarcastically think about, the Western countries are all worried about climate change, and we're worried about rising sea levels. I have this little graph up here because China for years now has been building artificial islands out in the South China Sea, right? So they're obviously not worried about global warming rising the ocean levels. And they're extending these. China's up there in that northern part. So, I mean, they're all the way down here in China Sea is where they're putting out these islands. They are building their military defenses strong and hard. It doesn't necessarily mean we're headed for a war, but it's this escalation of the Cold War, and we don't have to have a hot war to have major impact of what the Cold War does. And this is especially how it impacts the economy, because back in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, we talked about a peace dividend. And really all the good things that have happened over the last 30 years came as a result of that peace dividend. All the military technologies that were used exclusively for the military then got put out into the general population. Global satellites for GPS. We got all the telecommunication system from the satellites. None of that could have happened if we were under the old Cold War days, because all that technology was locked up as national security. So as we go more into a Cold War, though, we start locking up on those technologies. And we're seeing that happen with us restricting technologies to other countries, right? We're putting sanctions on buying Russian oil. We're not going to sell certain chips to the Chinese. These are just things that are going to whittle away at that peace dividend that was, created 30, 40 years ago. Something else to think about in terms of that, ever since World War II, we talked about strategic trade. And a lot of people thought trade meant for the economy. But that strategic trade wasn't about building our economy. It was actually about sacrificing our economy. We had the best economy coming out of World War II because we were the only country standing. And we took that booming economy over the next 50 years, and we segmented it out to what we call globalization, right? We helped rebuild Germany. We rebuilt Japan. Then we went in with the smaller nations, and we allowed all of them to come into the trade network, not because we wanted to build U.S. trade, but because we did an effort. We thought that if we were trading with our neighbors, we wouldn't be fighting them. That was the concept. And that's worked pretty well. But now we see that those relationships have broken down. China has become a competitor, not a colleague. And so we're moving from this strategic trade to a doctrine of what's being called strategic competitiveness, okay, strategic competition. And the competition, again, is not about globalization in terms of trade. It's about national defense. We're going to keep locking down those technologies more and more of things that we don't want other. That whole peace dividend goes away, and a lot of it's going to be concentrated on semiconductors. We think we all rely on oil. Well, if we lost Taiwan Semiconductor and that infrastructure that's in Asia right now, we're going to see a global depression like you've never seen before, right? It'll be like going into the dark ages, because we need these technologies that are all around the world. We need them in the United States, and we're eventually trying to bring them back here, and we most likely will, right? But if we don't, right, if there's a problem, if there's a hiccup in that system, then the supply chain issues that we've seen recently are a duration from the Cold War. Another big issue is the China slowdown. Okay, so this is related to us, not putting up restrictions with China in terms of trade and in terms of, both just economic trade, where we put tariffs on their products, but also in not allowing them to have technologies. I guess one aside on that, in the last slide I mentioned it. Now that we're restricting these technologies to countries like China, you can say, well, that could or could not end up going bad, or it could be just fine. We don't know how it all works out. But think about what happened in Japan in 1939. If you remember history, we stopped oil exports to Japan prior to World War II. But it wasn't only oil. It was also technology. We took away the emerging technology of aviation stuff to them. We didn't want them to have modern aviation technology. We didn't even want them to have like aviation fuel. And a lot of that is what prompted Pearl Harbor. So those are the kind of issues that we don't know if they're going to break, but if they do, they're major events. That takes us to the slowdown in China. China's been slowing down anyways. They were slowing down before the pandemic. They had a big peak up there for a while when everyone was ordering things off of Amazon. His economy has continued to stagnate because of the overemphasis that the Chinese Communist Party has. They're at the point now where about 70 or more, and I have question marks up here on these slides because we don't know the real numbers, because they don't tell us the real numbers. But we assume that about 70% or more of their corporations are all owned by the state, which means they're owned by the Chinese Communist Party. The problem with that, other than the fact that it's the Chinese Communist Party, is just that it's government in general, right? So that means productivity is down. And again, the estimates are that these state-owned companies are at least more unproductive, right? So a regular privately owned company is going to be 60% more productive than these state-owned companies. So as they keep making more and more companies state-owned, they keep depressing the growth of their economy. And we can ask, why would they do that? It's one of those kind of questions. I really don't care why. It's just that they are stagnating their economy to the point that their GDP this year is only going to be 3.8. United States GDP this year is going to be about 3. So you think about China's this big growth manufacturing for all these years. They're not growing at a rate much higher than ours. And while I question our numbers, I question theirs even more. So the problem with the slowdown in China is that all or at least half of the commodities are all flowing there, right? So the iron ore that's used in the world, the copper, all those things go to China to run through their factories. If they have a slowdown, that creates a major, could be depression level of what can happen with commodity prices. And while we all like that, because that would mean that prices come down, if you remember in like 2015, 2016, we had oil prices, copper prices all collapsing, and that brought down all the investments because Wall Street is driven by growth. And even though you would think that when inputs are going down, you think that would be good. It's actually not, because it just throws off everyone's investment. So a slowing of China is bad news. Their zero COVID tolerance policy is another thing too, that you got to scratch your head and wonder what the heck they're doing. We know that locking people down doesn't stop the spread of a virus, but they have doubled down on it, and they're not letting up at all. If you saw the protests earlier, how we're being shut down, they're still doing it right now. Today, Guangzhou, it's a city of 18 million people. They're cordoning off sections of that. Right now, the whole city's not shut down, but they could shut it all down, right? They're going after it. They've come up with what they consider I think there's like 1,000 cases, which in a city of 18 million doesn't seem like a big number to me, but they're ready to lock the whole thing down. And that's what's causing a lot of these continual supply chain disruptions in the U.S., because they shut down these cities. You saw what happened with the Apple, I think it was last week, where they call Apple villages, the Apple cities in China had to shut down because the workers got COVID. Both these guys' name is Li. I always kind of like to call them Lai, because they're liars out of China, but their name's Li. I can't pronounce their last names, but I mean, to introduce you to these two guys, because this is the tale of two different Lis. And I do this because I want to show you where China's headed. This guy in the blue tie, he was the number 2 man in the Chinese Politburo. In the last Congress that the Chinese had just over the summer, they took President Xi, and now he's kind of president for life. He's going on for his 3rd term. Had he not had a 3rd term, this was a guy that was likely to have taken over for him, because he was being groomed over the last 10 years or so. He's an economist. Years has been on building the Chinese economy. The reason he was number 2 in the Politburo is because he did a good job. He's done a really good job of making China more productive and more efficient. But he has now suddenly been retired, and the new guy, the other Li, is now the number 2 position. The important thing to know about him is he presided over the Shanghai lockdowns earlier this year. And when China went in to lock down Shanghai, which is a city of like 25 or more million people, a lot of people said there's no way you can lock down Shanghai. You can't lock down 25 million people. Well, Li said, the hell you can't. He locked down Shanghai. It was a brutal lockdown. And he now is number 2. He went from being like the mayor kind of thing, right? Mayor of Shanghai, to being the number 2 man in the Politburo in 8 months. And so he is now in position to be the next big guy in China. That's the direction they're heading. That's what they want. It's a surveillance state, and they're sacrificing the economy to have control. So will something break? Again, we saw this chart. I don't know, but any of those things that I just talked about, if we do get a break, of England, or something going on in China, more escalation in Ukraine, I think we'll drop hard below that long-term moving average. So what are you going to watch for? Aside from the international things that we've kind of talked about, in the U.S., this is a list of things we want to watch for, and I'm going to run through these quickly. All these slides, or most of these slides I'm going to show here in this series, are from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. What I like about their website is that you can compare, and it may be hard to see in the back, but there's vertical gray lines here. You can compare an immense amount of economic put in when the recessions were. So you can not only see the pattern, but you can see how it relates to recessions. So that's a good source of information for you. One of the most valuable things you'll get from the Federal Reserve is at this website. Unemployment, though, that's a key thing we want to look at. Remember, I mentioned unemployment. The reason they want to raise interest rates is to put people out of work. And as long as they just get like 2.5 million people, 3 million people out of work, that'll work. We'll have a soft landing. wage costs will come down, the economy will likely recover. But if it breaks, if we go to 4 million, 5 million, 10 million, right? COVID put 25 million people out of work, right? They've done this before. You can see every time there's a rise in unemployment on these gray lines, that's either was just before or just after recession starting. So people always say, well, is it the inflation rate, or excuse me, is the unemployment rate? We're only at 3.5% unemployment. That's pretty good. It doesn't matter what the rate is. It's just an increase in the rate. Whenever the rate goes up for any reason, we go into a recession. And that's because people live paycheck to paycheck, right? So it doesn't matter if you have 100% employment. The day the first person gets laid off, they don't have money. They can't pay their rent. Their car gets repossessed. And then it's just a snowball. So keep your eye on the unemployment rate. And so right now we're at 3.5%, 4.5%, maybe 5%. Anything above that, I think could be a real disaster. Fed funds rate. That was that chart I had earlier that Jack had mentioned for me to explain. Fed funds rate, the reason that's so important is that all the other rates are essentially based on that one. Okay, so when we talk about the Fed printing money, one of the methods they use is to adjust that interest rate. And again, if you look at when those recessions happened, they generally are brought on by an increase in the Fed funds rate. So the point of this is that recessions are created by the Fed, right? That's what they do. That's how they turn the spigot of the economy on and off. Bruce, do you have a question?
Yeah. On that unemployment rate, what is measured as people who are looking for a job.
Right.
So those who switch that said I'm out, they're not counted for that.
Yeah, so that's based on the universe of people that are working or looking for work. So there's 265-ish, 263 million people in the labor force total. 100 million of them are not counted in that number because they choose not to work. So the labor force participation rate right now is like 60. You have 37% of people not looking for jobs.
That includes like a lot of people in this room, right? Because they just count people that are W-2 employees.
Working. I mean, if you have a business, basically filing a tax return, showing income on a tax return. The other thing you really want to keep your eyes on is I have here credit card defaults. It's all defaults, and you can again track this at the Fed's website. They show corporate defaults. They show late payments on mortgages. All those things are a factor. The one I like to look at is the early warning, though, is for credit cards, because obviously you'll generally see a spike in that before we get to the recession. Again, pretty obvious here. Credit card default rates started to go up soon before we ever got into a recession, and they are going up now. Now they're going up from a really low level. I mean that rate is extremely low, which is why I'm not worried so much about our banking system. I think it's pretty much has good capitalization compared to where we were in the past. But again, it's when those people stop paying their credit card payments, then they get shut off from credit, and then they can't buy their Nike tennis shoes, or they can't go to Amazon and buy things. So that's what precipitates a recession. Purchasing Managers Index, that was that chart I had at the very beginning with all the little red marks in the countries that have a low rate. Anything below 50 is contractionary. This one is specifically for the U.S. What I want to point out here more than anything is we're still expansionary. We're still above 50, and even dropping below 50 won't necessarily put us into a recession. But look at where we were pre-pandemic. We were already coming down big time. The only thing that brought us out of that declining PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, is, in this case, manufacturing companies, what they're ordering, what their employment is, and they put it all into a number that shows the expected growth. So this is what we're measuring, the growth of the manufacturing economy here. And pre-pandemic, we were in a major decline anyways. Okay, then, of course, the pandemic came along and really crushed it. The only thing that took us out of that was $6 trillion in money that they printed, right? So we're right now back to where we were coming out of the commodity crisis of 2015 and 2016. They're raising rates, not lowering them. Again, that's my concern. If the Fed steps in tomorrow and starts printing money, that'll go back up because that's what happened. I don't know, right? They're talking about taking rates to 5.25. We want to keep our eyes on that because we can't trust what they say. We just want to watch what they do. Oil prices. Oil prices traditionally, if you look at those vertical lines, oil prices usually start collapsing once you get into the recession. They tend to go up before the recession, especially in the last big one. In 2008, oil prices peaked in 2008, right? So we were well into the recession when oil prices hit $140 some a barrel. But what almost always happens is once you're in that recession, oil prices collapse, okay? And I'm pretty are in the market. Most of that's in oil. I'm watching it close. I don't want to say this time it's different because, again, almost any time we get into a recession, oil collapses. This time it might be different for a number of reasons. Let me show you a couple of them. Not only what we have going on in Ukraine and with Russian oil and all that, but there are major shortages in the supply chain with oil. You can't get oil bits, drill bits. We can't get steel pipe. And guess where a lot of it comes from? Ukraine and Russia, right? Is where a lot of our piping comes from for the oil pipes. And this is natural gas as well as oil when I talk about this. The other thing is labor. They can't find the roughnecks to go out and work in the oil fields. The rig count, and rigs are what you're drilling for new production. Okay, it's not what's pumping the oil. It's what you're drilling for before you get to production. Look where we're at. We're barely above. I think that number's 575. Look where we were during the shale oil revolution. I mean, we were up 1,700. Now we're below 600. And you would think with oil prices being as high as they are, that would be going up like crazy. Some of it obviously is political policies and Biden not letting us drill on federal lands and those issues. But a lot of it is what I have here. If you can't get drill bits, you can't drill, right? They're trying to. It's just falling apart. This may be one of the reasons why oil stays higher longer, but we'll have to watch it. And when it does, if you do see oil coming down, though, that is probably a firm sign that things are going to fall apart. Last one here is corporate profits. And again, there's kind of the chicken and the egg thing here. What does a decrease in corporate profits cause the recession, or is the recession what causes the decrease in profits? I really don't want to debate it one way or the other. I don't think it matters. But if you look at some trends I have here, the red line going into these numbers here are quarters. So the red line is showing us how many quarters we were from the peak into when the market fell apart in 2008. So the big bottom there is 2008. The one above it, and this, again, I didn't make this happen. The graphs actually just correlated. The one above it is actually the pandemic, which is fit perfectly, almost as if it was planned. But you see a major drop in corporate profits for the pandemic. We're way up there. That top of that blue line, we're at the largest corporate profits in history by any stretch of the imagination. And again, why I've been pretty bullish all year long, because we are just making so much money at the corporate level. All that inflation is resulting because the corporations are passing the price increases along to you. So that's good news as far as Wall Street's concerned. But when you see this thing dip, again, that's when we'll go into recession. My big fear about things breaking, and it goes back to, let's think back pre-pandemic. Corporate profits were way down here, right? We're way up there. What happened? That was $6 trillion of printing money, and that money is not getting printed anymore. The bigger problem than that is if you take where that blue line ends, for next year, Wall Street's predicting 18% growth in corporate profits. I don't know how we get there. And I'm calling people, I'm calling analysts saying, where's this 18% coming from? And no one will tell you. It's just, it's like, so that worries me. That worries me greatly, because it isn't only that we're going to be flat, which we may be, right? If we have a soft landing, we'll be flat from that blue level. But what if we don't, right? What if the Fed doesn't print the money and we go all the way back to there? That's a huge collapse in corporate profits, and correspondingly, the stock market is going to crash.
These are Wall Street companies. Maybe they're doing better because of all the mom and pops.
Well, that's ultimately why they went up, right? Which is, again, is why I invested. People say, well, why would you want to invest in these evil corporations because that's where the money is. You know, I'd rather take the money I can make from them and play that game. But you're right. A lot of that has come about that, but that only goes so far, I think, when you look at that delta difference. I don't see how they get there. There's not more mom and pops to put out of business to take them to that next 18%. That's my concern. Incidentally, the slide to kind of go to weed out a little bit about what we said there. That other profitability slide I had, this one. This actually isn't Wall Street. So the highlighted number is what Wall Street's forecasting in next year. This blue number is from the Fed, and that's corporations, not just Wall Street. Because I did want to factor out a little. The Wall Street number's higher. It's even higher than that, which is scary.
What's the 253?
Can we line up for questions, please?
That's the 253 is the number that they put in the S&P 500 earnings. So if you take the S&P 500 today, it's 4,000, and you divide it by 253, that gives you the forward earnings ratio. Okay, again, I don't want to be total gloom and doom here because there will be a bottom, and when the bottom happens, you always get a rapid rise. So whether you're talking the COVID in red, post 9/11 in blue, the housing crisis in green, the best time to make money is after the crash, right? So a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, I would say on a monthly basis, it used to be on a weekly basis, but now on a monthly basis, I will still run into people that will tell me that they got out of the stock market back in 2008 when it crashed and they never got back in. That's the worst thing you can do, is because you'll miss all that uptrend. So don't be negative about that. Are we going to have a crash? I don't know. We could also be what's also very common is to have a range-bound market. And I've kind of tried to shadow these to show you how the market goes up to a certain level and then maybe comes down, but then it only goes so low. And is it the brown level, the green level, or this more yellow level? I don't know where that range bound is, but there's been periods of time like in 1945 through 1950, which I think is very emblematic of where we are now, rather than looking at us from the Arab oil embargo of 73. I think this post-World War II period is even more interesting because, you know, we came out of World War II and the government has spent all that money on fighting the war. Well, we came out of the pandemic, so they, you know, fought the war in the pandemic. And we have all those same problems that we have coming out of World War II, where you have more people coming into the labor force. You have supply chain shortages because back in those days, the factories that were making tanks and aircraft for the military had to switch over and start making cars and refrigerators and toaster ovens and things. And so you had major supply shortages, lots of high inflation, same problems we see today. But in that period from about 1946 to 1950, the market was just range bound. It would go up 10%. It would go down 10%. It would go up 10% down. And the beauty of this in a stock market is if you can trade that trend, if you buy and hold, you don't really make any money because it never goes up. It never goes back to its peak, or it takes a long time. But if you just trade some of those up and down movements, and you don't have to get them all, right? You don't have to buy here and sell there. If you buy and sell anywhere in those middles, you can still end up making as much or more than you're going to make in any kind of fixed income. Or, I'm not a fan of I bonds. We've gotten a lot of questions on TSP over the last year about I bonds because they were paying 9% last year. To me, that's where the government's forcing you into buying their debt and locking your money up, right? Because if you can catch any one of those little uprises, then you're going to make more than your 9%. So again, I'm cynically optimistic. I think we could be heading in some bad times if we get something breaking, but at the same time, there's great investing opportunities. I don't fight the elites. If I write another book, I'm going to call it Investing with the Illuminati, because I really think that's what you want to do. I mean, not to be a conspiracy theory. There's conspiracy theorists that worry about all the world being controlled by a group of people. I just accept the fact that it is, right? I don't care if it's true or not or whatever. I just look at the evidence. And if the elites are controlling everything, whether it's a global economy or the U.S. economy, they don't want it to totally fall apart because their wealth is in assets, right? Their wealth isn't in currency. If there's a reset of the U.S. dollar, or we go to some kind of digital currency or whatever that devalues the dollar, it doesn't impact them because their wealth isn't in the dollar. Their wealth isn't in yen. Their wealth isn't in euro. Their wealth is in assets. And we can participate in that by owning appreciating assets, right? Whether it be the real estate you own, the business, your own business that you own, or whether it be even buying Apple or Microsoft. Those stocks are assets, and they're not going to depreciate because these elite guys control them ultimately, right? They'll go up and down, but long term, they institute the policies they do to grow those corporations. So I remain cynically optimistic on that. I think there's never a collapse. And again, I mentioned several times when I was a kid, I honestly, my grandfather in the summer, I spent my mother worked. My father died when I was 6.5 months old. And so I would spend summers with my grandfather when I wasn't at school. So he would babysit me and we would go to the bar. That's what we did. He was a retired coal miner, and we would run our errands during the day. And every time we passed the VFW club, we would stop in and he'd have a shot and a beer and I'd have a Coke. And I learned a lot of things in the VFW club. But even back then, I was always hearing about how there's going to be a collapse, and it made sense. And as I got to be an adult, 1980s, I saw the same thing happen. There was a guy, Howard Ruff. He's the Peter Schiff of today. He used to be that guy with Howard Ruff back then. And they all have really good arguments about how gold's going to go to 10,000 or whatever when the system collapses. But the system never collapses because, the SOBs that run the system change the rules. And just we can talk about this all day, but just a couple examples. With the Federal Reserve, we all talk about them now printing money by buying treasuries. Well, that was never in their mandate. It was until like the 70s that they started doing that, maybe the late 60s. They just one day started doing it. It wasn't until 2008 housing crisis that they started buying mortgage-backed securities, right? They didn't get approved from Congress, right? They just went out and did it. Corporate debt during the pandemic, and we really don't know if or how much they bought, but all of a sudden they could buy corporate debt in 2020. So no legislation passed, no approval from anybody. They just changed the rules, and they because they changed those rules, the system never collapses because it's like you're playing football. They just keep extending the goal line, the goalpost. Something to think about Germany too. Germany's in a world of hurt right now. I think we're going to see them hit deindustrialization even worse than we saw in the 70s. But keep in mind, and I put Siemens up here. I could have put a bunch of German companies because there's a lot of them that are over 100 years old. But Siemens in particular, 1846 or so is when they got formed as a company, right? So they survived. They weren't even Germany back then, right? It was like the Prussian Empire or something, right? So they survived empires. They survived Bismarck and the Weimar Republic and the Nazis and their country being destroyed twice by World War and all the economic changes. Everything has happened over the years. The reuniting of Germany. These German companies are still around. It's still around. The same companies that produced the poison gas to kill the Jews in the Holocaust are selling Roundup today. Same companies, right? They don't go away. And so, if your money was in Deutschmarks at any of these times, you'd have lost your money. But if your money was in Mercedes or BMW or some big industrial company, it survives. And on to that, with it kind of closing up on the German thing again, could things fall apart and get really bad? I think it's very likely they could. But look at what they've done to kind of change the rules and make things better than they are right now. They've totally reversed their green policies in Germany right now. They're recommissioning their nuclear power plants. They're burning coal. They're in terms of liquid natural gas, they have at least five that I know of, liquid natural gas terminals under construction, and 2 or 3 of them are going to be up and running by the end of this year, right? By next month. That's 8 or 9 months in planning. Okay. You normally can't get a proposal made in 8 or 9 months, right? They've literally gone in and thrown out all the building standards, all the environmental impact statements, any curbs on being able to build these liquefied natural gas plants. They just went out and built them, right? They threw out all the rules because they changed the rules. And with us, if we have to go back to a Manhattan type project to start building, our own microchips or different elements of things that we need for the supply chain, I think we'll do that. I think they'll throw all the money at it to make it like a space shot and say, in 10 years, we're going to be totally independent from Taiwan for semiconductors or whatever, right? And they'll throw trillions of dollars at it. I don't know if timeline wise we'll be able to pull it off, but they will print the money to try and make it happen. So I remain optimistic on that. Keep your eye out on all that money that was confiscated from the Russians. I'm sure that the Germans are going to come along and take that money and use it to rebuild Ukraine with German workers, German industry, German components. That's in the cards for Germany. So I don't feel so sorry for them in terms of losing their industry, because they're going to probably profit from Ukraine. Again, I've said this before, we're the best house in a bad neighborhood. All the global choke points that we're having are energy, agricultural, weapon systems. We make all those here. We're world renowned in them. We're exporting them. The big things that we're going to do is all on. I'm running out of time here, so let me skip all this stuff through. We are reindustrializing. The trends of electrification, digitization, automation, and biotech are not going away. And they're all going to get amplified by the things we're seeing right now. So to the extent that you either invest in this stuff, or if you're young enough to learn it, to go into it as a career, or to implement it in your own business, that's what you want to do, because this is the trend that's not ending. And with that, I think I'm out of time.
Jazz hands for John Pugliano. And usually we take questions, but we're keeping on time today. I'm the time Nazi for a reason. We talked about Nazis in this presentation. So we have a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 12:30 to hear from Jack Spirko about the diet of the earliest Americans. So get your coffee, unload what you need to unload, and come on back. And if you want to ask John questions, he is right there. So the line that's over there should just go talk to him during the break.